So those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. You probably have heard this quote. It's attributed to George Santayana, who is a Harvard professor of philosophy. Sounds like what a philosopher would say. Now, he believed that human nature and irrational disregard for common sense, if you will, and of course, a lack of self-discipline. Because of all these things, history is doomed to repeat. The famous author Mark Twain responded that, well, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. It does rhyme. I thought that was a cool way of highlighting that. See, humans seem to echo the same mistakes across time. We seem to make the same mistakes over and over. In his letter to the church of Corinth, in chapter 9, Apostle Paul compared self-discipline with a rigorous athletic training observed at the Isthmian Games. Now, the Isthmian Games were held right outside Corinth, so they were very, very close to Corinth, and they were held there the year before and the year after the Olympic Games. So the Isthmian Games and the Olympic Games were very much related to one another and critical to the economy, if you will, of the region. The next section of the letter in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul wrote, after he talked about self-discipline, he talked about learning from the past. And that's where we are today in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 13. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Please follow along, if you will, in your own Bibles as I read 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and I'm going to start right with verse 1. Here is what Apostle Paul wrote. But I don't want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and that they all passed through the sea. They were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered all over the wilderness. Now, these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, that people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 of them died. We should not test Christ, as some of them did, and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. These things happened to them as examples, and were written down as warning for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you do not fall. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. The historical events that Paul wanted the church of Corinth to learn from all happened sometime between 1,300 to 1,500 years before Paul wrote the letter. These events were described in the Jewish scripture, primarily in the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers. Now, I know some of you have tried to read the book of Numbers, and yes, it is all about numbers. So if you like numbers, the book of Numbers is for you. A lot of stats, a lot of interesting things in there. Anyway, by God's intervention and the leadership of Moses, the nation of Israel escaped slavery in Egypt. And then after 40 years in the desert, they occupied the region known as Canaan. Now, verse 2 mentions being baptized into Moses. Baptized into Moses. Well, baptism was a symbol of submitting to one's authority. Being baptized into Christ means that we accept the leadership of Jesus and follow his teaching and his way of life. That's what baptism is. Israel followed Moses by God's appointment, which means they were baptized into Moses. They followed Moses' leadership. In verse 3, Paul wrote that in their journey, the nation received spiritual food and drink. Spiritual food and drink. And then the rock that provided the water was none other than Jesus Christ himself. Is this metaphor? Is this a way of speaking that is not really the reality? No, it's not really metaphor. Listen to this. Paul referenced Exodus chapter 16. Now, in Exodus chapter 16, the verse 4 says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to get out each day and gather enough for the day." And then in chapter 17, God miraculously provided water from a rock. Now, in the ancient mindset, the heavens, when you talked about the heavens, they were the spiritual realms. So the heavens are the spiritual realms. The food and water provided from the heavens were by definition from the heavenly realms, which meant they were from the spiritual dominion. Spiritual food and drink. So Paul is really not being metaphorical here, but is using the ancient mindset of what spiritual meant. By the way, nowadays we use the word spiritual in a slightly different way, don't we? So spiritual food and drink for Paul was the fact that they were provided by the heavens, by the Lord himself. Spiritual food and drink. Now, let me briefly explain the expression, the rock was Christ. The rock was Christ in verse 3. Ancient Jewish theology included God's physical manifestation in human affairs, sometimes as a human being and sometimes as the angel of the Lord. By the way, think back to Abraham and Sarah. Abraham and Sarah saw two strangers, and these strangers looked like human beings. Okay, so read that passage because that is an example of the Lord coming into the human affairs as a human being. Now, the followers of Jesus recognized Jesus not only as an anointed messenger from God, but also worthy to receive worship equal to God. Jesus himself claimed divinity at his trial, which drew the accusation of blasphemy from the high priest. St. Jude, in the book of Jude, St. Jude in chapter 1, verse 5, wrote that Jesus himself was the one who led the Israelites out of Egypt. Some of your translations say the Lord. The Lord. Earlier manuscripts have the word Jesus in there as well. Okay, so St. Jude explicitly said that Jesus himself was the one who led the Israelites out of Egypt. So Paul aligned with all that in verse 4. They drank from the spiritual rock, the supernatural rock from the heavenly realms that accompanied them, and the rock was Christ. Yet, notwithstanding the proximity to the divine, and in spite of feeding on spiritual food and drink, many did not get the point. Verse 5, nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. With that introduction, then Paul wrote his main point twice. His main point, here it is. He wrote it in verse 6, and then he wrote it in verse 11. Learn from history. Learn from history. These things occurred as examples for two reasons. One, to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things. Two, to serve as warnings for those on whom the culmination of the ages has come. That's us. The culmination of ages has come. These things occurred as examples. What things? What things? Well, the historical events that took place while the nation traveled for 40 years in the desert before settling in the land of Canaan. Verse 7, the root problem was idolatry, and the historical event referenced by Paul was described in Exodus chapter 32. Exodus chapter 32. Fueled by idolatry, the people of God made up their own religious service, and then they had a party. And let me tell you, according to the text here, it was fun, and people felt great, and it was uplifting, and it had some kind of spiritual fulfillment, and it was idolatry. It was idolatry. In verses 8 through 10, Paul described three idolatry actions and three consequences. The first idolatry action was sexual immorality. This is sexual expression outside God's intended harmony. The consequence? In one day, 23,000 people died. 23,000 people died. Most likely, this is a reference to Numbers chapter 25. I told you the Numbers, the book of Numbers, like numbers, right? That's why it's called Numbers. Well, the book of Numbers describes this and describes a deadly pandemic. It's a deadly pandemic. In Numbers chapter 25, verse 1, we read, while Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women who invited them to the sacrifices to their gods. And then in verse 9, those who died in the plague numbered 24,000. Did you catch that? Wait a minute. You got a problem here. Yeah. Some of you are noticing it. Yeah. The numbers are different. Was it 23 or 24,000? Oh, we found an error in the Bible. Here it is. 23 or 24. Now, let me tell you, people critical of the Bible use these verses to attack the reliability of the Bible. Why do we have different numbers? I want to know, why do we have different numbers? Why is that? Well, the real answer is that we don't know because Paul's not here, so we can ask him. I have no idea. Now, smart people, let me tell you, some very, very smart people have some ideas about this. But you know what's interesting? What's interesting is that those ancient readers who read Paul's letter and had access to the evidence, to the textual evidence in the book of Numbers, they were not fazed by these numbers. They were not fazed, 23, 24. So while we may not know why Paul wrote 23 when Numbers has 24,000, but we do know that his readers, they weren't fazed by that. They weren't fazed by that. And as I said earlier, some smart people have offered two kinds of explanation. The first explanation is that Paul made an honest mistake. Maybe it was a typo, okay? Or maybe he misspoke the correct number. By the way, I've done that on several occasions, okay? I've actually done that in one of my past sermons. I insisted multiple times that on the wrong reference until I got a little text in my sermon from one of our kids. Hey, Dad, that's not who that's not who wrote Acts. I'm like, oh, okay, never mind. Never mind. It's in the recording. Go look it up. All right. So I made an honest mistake. Is that less of God's word that was preached that day? Absolutely not. It was an honest mistake. So option number one, or the explanation number one, and that Paul made an honest mistake. Another explanation is that perhaps Paul might have had additional knowledge regarding the 24,000. Maybe 23,000 died in one day, and then another 1,000 died before or died after. The point is that was not Paul's point. That's the point. That was not Paul's point. Paul's main concern was not the exact number of people who died, but rather learning from history. Learning from history. And with that said, don't set your heart on evil things such as sexual expression outside of God's harmony. The second idolatry example in verse 9 was testing the Lord. Those who did were killed by snakes. The historical event was described in Numbers chapter 21, verse 4. They traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom. But the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses. Verse 6, then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died. That's what Paul is talking about. That's the event. The third idolatry example in verse 10 was grumbling. And this ought to worry many of us. Grumbling. Those who did were killed by the destroying angel. And most likely, Paul referenced the incident described in Numbers chapter 16. Many Israelite leaders came as a group to oppose Moses and Aaron. It's like a posse. And they're coming to Moses and Aaron. And let me tell you, it did not end well for those people nor their families. Those were the three examples that Paul gave. And then as Paul moves on into verses 11 and through 13, Paul restated the bottom line. Learn from history that idolatry is lethal, and it can manifest itself through sexual expression, opposition to God's way, and antagonism towards God's appointed leaders. Paul is saying, be careful to choose God's way. Paul wrote, God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted or tested or put into a position to choose a path beyond what you can bear. Be careful to choose God's way. When you are tempted, not if, when you are tempted or tested or put into a position to choose a particular path, God will provide a way out so you can endure it. In other words, God will provide an opportunity to align yourself with His universal harmony, even when that is difficult. Even when that is difficult. Now, let's apply the text to us. What can we learn from the past? After all, Paul's letter was written 2,000 years ago, and the events that he referenced happened 1,500 years before that. That's 3,500 years before that, before our time. Well, let me start with some basics. Let me start with the basics because Paul wrote to followers of Jesus, okay? If you want to learn more about the teachings of Jesus and His way of life, you're in a good place. You're in the right spot. That's what we do here. We enroll people into an apprenticeship program. Any apprenticeship program, anybody that is enrolled in an apprenticeship program may not have all the details of the program. They may not fully understand how it's even possible to complete the program. But what they do know is that at the end of the program, they will be like the master. They'll get some skills. They'll get some knowledge. Same with Jesus. You may not have all the details, nor fully understand, but in the end, you will be more like Jesus. You will be more like Jesus. That is the end goal of apprenticeship to Jesus. And I'm inviting you today to become an apprentice of Jesus. You've got nothing to lose and everything to gain. Now, if you're a follower of Jesus, or if you're considering becoming one, I'd like to share with you several ways to apply 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Let me first talk about spiritual food and drink. Okay? In our modern context, the Lord's Supper has become a kind of spiritual food and drink. At Agape, we celebrate communion every Sunday. And as the people of God, we are invited to take part. And we do that. But just like the ancient people of God who took part in the spiritual food and drink in the desert, we too can displease the Lord with our disobedience, and we can fall under judgment. Receiving communion, my friends, is not a magic pill that saves you. It's just not. So be mindful of what really gives and sustains your spiritual life. Okay, the second application. The second application is regarding examples. Examples. God used the life and circumstances of his people to bring his message to the world. And he's continuing that today. It's happening today. People hear what we say and how we say it. They see what we do, and then they compare it with what we have said. And here's the question. Do all three align with the teachings of Jesus and his way of life? What about the difficult circumstances you might be going through? Perhaps they serve as example and as message for someone else. You might be the message. You might be the message. Okay, the third application is regarding idolatry. Idolatry. Our modern day idolatry is very different than the idolatry experienced by the nation of Israel in the desert and the idolatry practiced in the ancient city of Corinth. Yet, idolatry is alive and well in our culture. Consider the three examples from the text in our own modern context. Consider sexual expression. Could that be an idol? Consider opposition to God's harmony. Some people call it God's law. Could that be an idol? And antagonism towards God's leaders. Okay, the fourth application is about being tested and tempted and put into a position to make a choice. That's what that means when the text talks about being tested or tempted. What will you do? What will you do? Your decision, your test, your temptation will be to go rogue, but you can resist that impulse. In God's cosmic order, humanity has the privilege of choice. We have the privilege of choice. People are never faced with decisions that go beyond their ability. People have the power to make tough, personal decisions that align with the teachings of Jesus and his way of life. In other words, Paul absolutely destroyed our popular expression, I had no choice. I had no choice. Paul destroys it. I had no choice is a popular cultural myth that sounds good. I had no choice is a lie. All right, so let's talk actions. Let's talk actions. Now that we understand the text in context and we have at least 4 modern day applications, let me suggest several practical actions. Now, I don't expect you to be able to do all of them all at once, so pick one of them and do it right away, and then the others write down for future reference. Okay, pick one of these, start doing it right away to create a habit. Here's 5 practical actions you can take. Number 1, study the past to learn not just knowledge, but wisdom. Not just knowledge, but wisdom. Knowledge gives you useful information, and wisdom offers compassionate application. Let me say that again. Knowledge gives you useful information, and wisdom offers compassionate application. I believe that studying the events recorded in the scripture, appreciating the biblical culture and understanding the contextual mindset will increase our effectiveness as followers of Jesus. I've mentioned the book of Exodus. What if you were to read the book of Exodus and as one reads an interesting biography from the library? An interesting biography from the library. That's what Exodus is. Read it with a notebook by your side so you can capture your musings and your questions. Study the past. Number 2, become an apprentice of Jesus. I mentioned this earlier, but you know what I didn't say? I did not say how one goes about doing that. How does one become an apprentice of Jesus? It's rather simple. Speak to God and tell him you want to be an apprentice of Jesus. It's as simple as that. Say, Lord, creator of this universe, I want to be an apprentice of Jesus of Nazareth. And that begins your journey. That begins your journey. Now, once you make that verbal commitment, that heart and mind commitment, there's another commitment you need to make. Make a commitment to be part of an apprenticeship training center. An apprenticeship training center. Okay? In our culture, we call it church. Okay? That's how we call it. We would love to have you be part of our community. And if you're ready to start your apprenticeship, text me and let me know you'd like to start. Text YESGOD to 84576. That's the number we use, 84576. Just start with a simple yes, God, and let's get you started in the apprenticeship program. Number 3. This might be interesting, but I think you've heard me talk about it before, but set up what I call obedience reminders. Obedience reminders. Listen, spiritual food is important, but obedience matters more. Obedience reminders can be as simple as a note card on your mirror or on your refrigerator. The note cards can have favorite Bible verses or some kind of encouragement towards the new spiritual habit you are trying to cultivate. Number 4, don't waste your circumstances. Don't waste your circumstances. They may be the examples you or someone else needs to see, especially if you do what Paul did. When cursed, blessed. When persecuted, endure. When slandered, answer kindly. Or don't answer at all if you can't. Don't waste your circumstances. When cursed, bless. Bless rather than curse. All right, 5, change your decision vocabulary. Change your decision vocabulary. Be careful not to be lulled into the cultural agreement towards idolatry. God will not let you be tempted or tested or put into a position to choose a path beyond what you can bear. Replace I had no choice with based on the wisdom given to me, I made the best possible choice. Stop using the phrase, I had no choice. Study the past to gain wisdom. Be an apprentice of Jesus. Set up reminders to obey. Don't waste your circumstances and change your vocabulary. You have a choice to make.